immigration has become a huge issue with enormous negative connotations. And I'd like to suggest that three things are key. First of all, that, of course, you manage migration, and that you have a system that commands public confidence. Secondly, that you manage the consequences of migration. If Labour were to admit we got it wrong when it dragged its heels, Labour government, for example, in implementation of equal treatment of agency workers and the directly employed, huge issues of insecurity in the world of work that require to be properly addressed. I know because I used to organise workers, and I was part of the negotiating team that agreed equal treatment of agency workers and the directly employed in 2004. The regulations finally come in 2011. Also, we did not address the acute problem of a lack of housing in some of the hard-pressed communities where competition for housing caused conflict. So there are real issues about how you manage the consequences. Other than you address those real fears that people have about the consequences for them, then what you do is you fuel the problem, you don't deal with the problem. I think the third and final thing is that we give leadership in what is a very difficult debate. And that's what we're going to do tonight.
My view on Labour and immigration is very simple. It's very, very simple. Some would say naive, I would say truthful. And that is Labour can only ever win any debate on migration if it can win the argument on migration. It can only win the argument on migration if it can deal with all of the lies, myths and distortions that dominate this debate. The recent ONS statistics, which showed a 20% rise in net migration, were represented on the front pages of the Mail and the Express and the Telegraph and even in the Standard and on Sky News and the BBC as a rise in immigration, which is a different statistic. In fact, the ONS figures show that the level of immigration hadn't really budged over the last few years, and the reason why net migration was at a high was because the number of people leaving the country had fallen. But that's just one small aspect of the debate. Immigration is good for the economy. That's not to say it's an unadulterated good. Of course not, nothing is. But how can we have a debate about immigration when no one mentions the fact that in 2007 a government report found that migrants had added £6 billion to output growth in 2006. That's equivalent to 1.5% on the basic rate of income tax. It's not a statistic you ever see on the front of the Mail or the Telegraph, or even, should I say, the Guardian. So this idea that there is a monolithic view amongst the so-called monolithic white working class on immigration, and they're all anti, and they all want them all kicked out, and they're all going to vote for the Tories and UKIP unless we do as many draconian things as they do, I just think that evidence doesn't support that. The idea that immigration lost Labour the general election is a pernicious myth that needs to be dealt with in any debate. The way you deal with the housing shortage is, build more houses. When you have fears about wages and immigrants undercutting wages, the way you deal with that is to enforce the minimum wage, crack down on employers who exploit migrant labour, bring in a living wage. Again, you don't go after the people who are equally suffering on the other end. So there's a section that I don't think has any problems. There's another section which does have problems based on their hopes, fears, anxieties, personal life experiences, job situations. And then there's a third group of people, and this is a smaller group, but they're there nonetheless, and we have to accept this point, who do have a racist mindset. Everyone says it's not racist or immigration. It isn't racist or immigration. But let's not be under any pretense that in this country there is still a hardcore tiny minority of people who are racist. Look at, for example, BNP voters. We're always talked about, these are Labour voters who've gone to the BNP. According to YouGov polling, 1 in 3 BNP voters believes that black people are intellectually inferior to white people. Eric Forth, the late Tory MP, once said that there are millions of white Anglo-Saxon people in this country. They're bigoted and they need to be represented. I agree with him, but they shouldn't be represented by the Labour Party. Labour should be telling a much more positive, hopeful, uplifting story about migration and our national story and our national identity. Labour should be fighting tooth and nail to dispel the myths and lies that distort this toxic debate. Labour should be making the case for diversity and for equality of all.
Firstly, we have to answer the question why so many employers will take someone from another country rather than a British citizen. We're into British jobs and British people. Take a British citizen now who may indeed be from my Kashmiri community, because they're the ones most angry, Mehdi, about Slovakians and so on coming into polls into Rotherham. Why does the guy who runs the Olympics now, not the construction, the actual provision of the games, he said that 1 in 4 of the people he is hiring from England cannot read or write adequately. So what are our teaching unions doing? What is our school system doing to ensure that every British child leaves school, whether it's 16 or 18, properly equipped? And finally, we have to tackle intolerance. The code word for racism now is to denounce multiculturalism. Merkel did it, Sarkozy did it, and lo and behold, you know, the one bit of European politics David Cameron supports is anti-multiculturalism.
Labour lost the public's trust. Labour could win the public's trust back. Saying good things about immigration is not a high road to ruin. It's actually a route to having a mature conversation about an issue. Voters recognise that this is a complex issue. One thing I would suggest is that Labour should not, under any circumstances, follow the coalition down the route of caps, because the cap that the coalition have proposed is a dishonest cap. It can't be achieved through policy. It is, in my view, possibly the silliest policy they could have come up with in this respect, because it takes the public for suckers. It relies on net migration, which involves, as has been pointed out, the number of people who leave as well as the number of people who arrive. It also depends on categories of migration, including migration from within the EU and asylum migration, that we don't have full policy control over. It is very unlikely, in my view, that they will hit that cap. And when they fail to hit that cap, because they told the public this was what they were going to do, they will lose the public's trust and they will suffer the same kind of criticism, just as Labour did when they promised policies that then did not deliver in terms of the numbers. If you promise a policy, we will have a managed migration system, people will come, that they will be beneficial to the economy, and you deliver on that, then you win public trust, because you're not trying to take the public for fools, and they're not fools. Focus on those kinds of migrants that the public recognise the benefits of and talk about them a lot more. There was very little talk about why it's consistent with British values to take in asylum seekers. Very little about the stories of asylum seekers who've been granted asylum by Britain and have benefited hugely as a result. Very little about how dependent the NHS or the care system is on migrants. I mean, I've got a PhD student working on doctors in the NHS. The expansion of the NHS under Blair and Brown couldn't have happened without migrant doctors in the way that it did. That case was never made properly. And these are the kind of cases where the public is actually on the side of the Labour Party in this respect. In conclusion, sound management, achievable policies, and focus on the positive kinds of migrants that voters sympathise with, that is a route back to winning the public's trust on this issue of migrants.
I think we need to go back to being absolutely strong in some positive messages about what we stand for, what our values are in relation to migration, rather than trying to reach for the bottom, reach for the lowest common denominator of voter prejudice. We actually need, first of all, to stand up and be counted and say, we are not prepared to tolerate that prejudice in the way in which we do our campaigning and are engaging with the electorate. We are always going to have economic and family migration, where it is inevitable, and we need to plan on that basis. And that means planning the way in which our employment, our labour market, our public service provision, and our protections for everybody in this country, however they've arrived here, actually offer a level and higher quality playing field, rather than trying to diminish services and set up resentment between one group of have-nots and another group of have-nots. We need to start planning schools capacity, because people are having children. They've arrived, they're staying, they're having families. Our schools are going to become fuller. We'd better start building classrooms now. Similarly, we need to recognise how many women in particular are being trafficked into this country or coming into this country and at best being put into utterly abusive domestic labour. At worst, maybe victims of physical and sexual abuse. And we need to be absolutely clear that migrants who arrive in this country, by whatever route, will be entitled to all the protections that we offer people in this country. We should be proud of that. This is a safe place to be. And that's got to be entirely separate from whether you're here legitimately or not, and the course of making decisions about your entitlement to remain. While you're here, we will look after you, we will keep you safe. We should be proud of that. The third thing I want to say is that I think that it is really important that we are very careful how we attack the coalition government. And Robert's highlighted the fact that their cap is doomed to fail. Well, it is. But what we don't want to do is get into some sort of race for toughness, that our CAP would have been better than their CAP. We need to move the debate into a different space altogether. Otherwise, we will do two things. Not only will we fail as well when we come back to power, but we are actually contributing to this climate of hostility and hysteria. And I am absolutely unapologetic about the success of multicultural communities. And I have a particularly good example, one I'm very, very proud of in my constituency in Old Trafford. That's a community where so many different populations, different people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds live together extremely harmoniously, very successfully. It's a real role model of how you can actually make multiculturalism a success rather than a minus for our society. And I think we on the ledge should be actually talking up good instances of what migration has brought to us over 2 and 3 generations, rather than allowing ourselves to be boxed into the position of seeing it as a social and economic problem.
So there's a journey that all immigrant communities go through, which is migrant to citizen. Now that journey, that path, is longer for some communities than other communities. But what I would advocate, and has already been echoed by some of the speakers, is to give leadership in direction. We are a nation of immigrants. Say it, don't be scared about it, this is our history. There are those who have argued that we can't say that, it's electoral suicide, we will never get into power if we lead in that way. I'm a simple person, honestly. We went to war on a lie. Why can't we persuade and give a lead on facts and reality and statistics? The second suggestion is to make it easy to enforce employment law. You know, immigration legislation cannot be, policy cannot be in isolation. It has to link with other aspects of policy, and one of those is to make it difficult for employers to exploit workforces, not just British but also foreign workforces. Finally, build more houses, schools, otherwise the working class will turn to the fascists, Islamophobes and the Tories. And I really believe there can be a better group. Thank you.